Thanks a lot. I'll just yell until I get the mic turned on. Thanks a lot for coming out. And thanks to the rooms for inviting me and figuring out how to do a public gathering and keep us safe. I really like doing these in front of a live audience. I can't stand doing things on the computer. So this is a real treat. I am with the Shipwreck Preservation Society. And you may or may not have heard of us. We started up back in 2013. And it was a bunch of us that were interested in promoting shipwreck history around the province. And we'll just start off. This is an image of one of the Bell Island shipwrecks. It's the Rose Castle, which happens to be the deepest and the best preserved of the Bell Island shipwrecks. And you can see all the hatches, and so that was carrying iron ore when it was torpedoed. So like I said, I'm Neil Burgess. I'm the president of the Shipwreck Society. And what I wanted to do today was just share with you guys what we've been doing at the Society basically over the last year or so. Because we've been doing a lot of stuff. And I thought people might be interested, and I'm glad you turned out. So our mission, if you want to call it that, is to advance awareness, documentation, stewardship of shipwrecks around the province. So I'm going to talk about those three things today. I'm going to talk about the research we're doing on shipwrecks, how we're actually going out and documenting the shipwrecks that are on the seafloor, how we raise awareness of shipwreck history, all the efforts we're doing on that. And I'm not really going to talk too much about the protecting shipwrecks because that's pretty bureaucratic, and we do that with the Provincial Archaeology Office, and it's not very interesting to hear about as much as the first two. So we'll start off now with researching the shipwrecks. I've got to figure out where to point this. So we're really lucky in Newfoundland that we've got a huge resource of books that people have written about our shipwreck history, and there's all kinds of them. Enemy in the Doorsteps about the Bell Island shipwrecks. Captain Joe Prim did a great book about all the shipwrecks from the Second World War. And then we've got people like Frank Galgay and Robert Parsons who've published any number of books on shipwrecks. So if you've got a particular shipwreck you're interested in, you can probably find it in one of those books. When we're gathering information, we're going to places like here at the rooms, both the museum and the collection in the basement of artifacts, and up to the provincial archives upstairs to look at old documents and photographs. And we're also going out to the hundreds of community museums across the province who also have lots of information and artifacts from old shipwrecks. And we're going further afield. So for a project that I'm going to talk about later on in this talk, we spent a lot of time up at Library and Archives Canada, which is the National Archive up in Ottawa, where all the records from the military are kept and the federal government. And then we've gone even further afield. That's a picture of the U-boat museum over in Germany, where we got a lot of U-boat documentation and photographs from for the Bell Island exhibit that I'll talk about later. Whoops. So what do we find when we go to all these museums? Well, we find lots of artifacts. And this is a whole bunch of different things from a whole bunch of different places. You can see that's a telescope from Bell Island shipwrecks. This is a jug, pottery jug that's got marine growth on it that was on a shipwreck. This is the bell that was recovered from the shipwreck of the Rose Castle, the ship that I showed you before. This is a cup with the crest of the Cunard Ocean Line. There was, you may not know, there was a huge Cunard ocean liner that ran aground down near Rose Blanche in 1918, carrying troops home from Europe after the First World War. That's one of the Mushrow astrolabes upstairs on display. That's from the 1600s, came from a shipwreck out at Isle of Mort. And that's a compass that came from one of the Bell Island shipwrecks. In the archives that we go and search, we find all some kinds of old pictures. So that's the Caribou. This is the PLM-27, one of the Bell Island shipwrecks. That's the Rose Castle that I showed you before, and that's a schooner photograph. So lots of images that we find useful when we now go and dive on those shipwrecks. We can see what they looked like when they were afloat. And we find some real treasures. So these 3 black and white photographs on top here, and this photo here, all came from a scrapbook, photo album, that was shot by one of the crew members of this patrol boat in the Second World War that was working here in Newfoundland. And this whole photograph album was up in the National Archives up in Ottawa, and it was uncatalogued. Nobody had ever done anything with it. So in our Bell Island project, we put a lot of these photographs online for people to enjoy. And then these 2 photographs come from an album that was shot by the captain of the U-boat that first attacked at Bell Island. And these photos are actually photos from Newfoundland. So this photograph came from before the attack. The U-boat went to the Strait of Belle Isle up in southern Labrador, and there's actually an iceberg in the corner of this photograph that doesn't show up very well here. And this photograph was the day after the attack, when that U-boat sank the Saganaga and Lord Strathcona over in 1942 at Bell Island. And that's the damage that was caused to the conning tower when the sub actually accidentally ran into the side of the Lord Strathcona during the attack. We find lots of documents, endless amounts of documents. But just to give you a flavor for the kind of stuff we find, the Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, back in the Second World War, kept a written record of every radio message. These were actually sent by telegraph, radio telegraph, but there are records of every message. So this is the message that said that the Lord Strathcona and the Saganaga had been sunk in September in 1942. And this document here was over in an archives in Cape Breton. It's from the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation, which owned the mines on Bell Island. And this was evidence that we used in our exhibit that I'll talk about a little later on, that proved that 5 of the men whose names are included in all the books on the Bell Island shipwrecks and on the memorials to the Bell Island shipwrecks, those 5 men are always listed as having died when the Rose Castle sank, but they actually, in fact, reported for work in Sydney the week after the Rose Castle went down. So they actually survived. And this was the first bit of research that uncovered that. So we've got to, I don't know what we're going to do with all the memorials around, chisel out their names or cover them over or whatever. But the boys actually lived long lives. We also, in our searches in the archives, find lots of maps. These 2 hand-drawn ones are actually done by military eyewitnesses to the Bell Island attacks, and they're tremendously useful for figuring out what actually happened and where the submarine was and where the boats were. This is an official map done from the military report after the sinkings. And we find maps like this. Now, you probably can't see it. I realize this is too small, but there are 700 shipwrecks listed around the edge of this map with dates and the name of the ship. And those 700 shipwrecks are only from the last 50 years of the 1800s. So the number of shipwrecks around our province is staggering. The mythology is there's 10,000 shipwrecks around Newfoundland and Labrador. Nobody knows the real number, but this gives an indication. They are everywhere, but it's interesting to note that 1/5 of them are down at Cape Race. And there's an interesting story behind that. So if somebody wants to hear that, you can ask me a question at the end and I'll tell you. The other things we find, we go over to Europe and we find shipyard plans of the boats that are sunk here. a lot of the ships were actually built in Europe, in Scotland and England, and on the continent. And so the historical records of what those ships looked like when they were built are over there. This is really useful for us when we dive on the ships to figure out what rooms were used for what purpose. And we find artwork. This is a fabulous painting of the sinking of the Saganaga by a former resident of Bell Island who was a young boy when the attacks actually happened on Bell Island. And the family of, he's passed on now, and his family was really generous in letting us use this artwork in our online exhibit, our website on the history of the Bell Island shipwrecks. And if you want to see this painting in the flesh, you can go over to the Bell Island Museum, and it's hanging there. We find a huge number of eyewitness accounts of what happened when ships were sunk. I'm just using examples here from the Bell Island shipwrecks. Gordon Hardy is a sailor from Cape Breton who was 17 years old on the Rose Castle when it was torpedoed at Bell Island. He was a mess steward, and he taped an interview that tells about how he dove off the side of the wreck into the ocean just as the second torpedo blew the ship up. So just amazing. This picture here is a young Lloyd Reese, who was a young teenager in the Second World War, and he left a written account of his eyewitnessing of both Bell Island attacks. And there's all these other folks. There was an official on the customs boat that was picking up survivors. There's the head constable for the RNC on Bell Island who filed reports after the attacks. There's a French-Canadian survivor of the PLM. And then we also go out into the communities and we collect our own taped interviews, recorded interviews. And one time we did that again for the Bell Island project. We went over to Bell Island and collected family stories. And we were really lucky to get Dale Jarvis, who many of you know, storyteller and intangible heritage curator here in St. John's, and Teresita McCarthy, who's the executive director of the Bell Island Museum, helped us out with this. And we got a lot of great stories out of that. So does anybody have any questions? You can yell out if you want about all the kind of research and where we go and all that kind of stuff. If not,
I want to hear about the story down in Race Rocks that you were going to tell.
I'll do that at the end. How's that?
Okay.
You give me a prod at the end, and I'll talk with that.
So that map of showing all the shipwrecks, is that the same one that you can purchase? You know, in the souvenir shop, they have a big map of all the shipwrecks.
There are a bunch of maps out there, and they only cover portions of the province. That one is over in the Center for Newfoundland Studies at Memorial University's library. But that image is actually online, and you can download it from the Digital Archive Initiative at Memorial University in the library website. Okay, so now let's talk about what we do to go out and document shipwrecks. So that's one of the Bell Island shipwrecks, and that photo is actually taken by a professional photographer who's worked with us on a couple of projects. But going out and photographing the current state of shipwrecks is really useful for monitoring how fast they're deteriorating, and also in the case of unidentified shipwrecks, it helps us do the research and identify them if we can. Oh. So that's another picture by Jill Heinerth on the Bell Island shipwrecks. And you can see the ships are in really good shape. They're still there, but they're covered in marine growth. So Jill talks about it being both very beautiful and very sobering, diving on these ships when she knows that sailors' lives were lost when they were sunk. And those are some details from those Bell Island shipwrecks. That's a shoe that a sailor was probably wearing when the ship was sunk. That's a broken china plate. And that is actually the back end of a torpedo that is lying on the seafloor just behind the Rose Castle. And those are all the batteries that powered the electric motor in the torpedo. And you can see it's rotting away now. But I'm interested in researching the story of that torpedo, because it may be the one that helped sink the Rose Castle. But we work on a lot of other wrecks around the province. This is one of the oldest ones we've worked on. This is a Royal Navy frigate from the 1600s, HMS Sapphire, that was set on fire by its captain and sunk in Bay Bulls Harbor when it was cornered and attacked by a bunch of French ships. And this is way back in 1696. So some of you may have heard that there was some archaeology work done on this ship back in the 1970s by a group in Newfoundland called the Newfoundland Marine Archaeology Society, and then later by Parks Canada's underwater archaeologists. And they excavated a small portion of this shipwreck, and a lot of the artifacts are downstairs in the basement of the rooms, and there are still some in Ottawa, I think. And these are the cannons that are left on the sea floor. And you can see there's the odd tire and beer bottle thrown in. But it's interesting to work on these old shipwrecks. The reason we went out here is the Provincial Archaeology Office, which has the job of protecting archaeological sites in the province, was concerned about all the industrial wharf development that's happened recently in Bay Bulls, because it's only about 150 meters away from this shipwreck site. So they were just concerned to make sure that this shipwreck site was not being damaged by all the ship traffic and that. And we went out and did that, and there's no concerns at all. Here's some cannons that are on the sea floor just off Balleen Harbor. You can see there's 3 cannons out here by a rock, and that's one of the cannons there, and that's another cannon there. It's a little hard to see because of all the marine growth on it, but these are very old cannons, probably much more than 100 years old. And there's no evidence of a shipwreck here. There's just 3 cannons. So it may be that a ship ran aground on that rock at night or in the fog, and in order to get off the rock, they had to lighten the load on the ship, and they pitched these cannons over. But it would be interesting to come up with a full story for them. I'm going to go back to the Bell Island shipwrecks again. This is a high-tech sonar image. Ken Keeping is the vice president of the Shipwreck Society, and his day job is mapping the seafloor with sonar equipment. And so he went out to the Bell Island shipwrecks and did a great job of mapping them with his sonar gear. It's called multi-beam sonar, and it's very high resolution. So you can see this is where the 2 torpedoes hit the Saganaga, and it pretty much cut it in 2. And all this blue is the iron ore spilling out from the damaged cargo holds onto the seafloor. And you can see these are all the hatches that are full of iron ore on the ship. And the detail of his sonar is amazing. That little red blur right there is the cannon on the stern of the ship. All these cargo ships had one deck gun to defend them from submarines if the submarine was on the surface. This is the other kind of thing we do for documenting shipwrecks, and that's drawing these maps, site maps of the shipwrecks. Many of you are probably familiar with the shipwreck down in Conception Harbor. There's a whaling ship there that's visible above water, and that's this one here. But most people don't realize that there's 2 other ships just underwater behind it that you can't see from the surface. So we went down and mapped those out, and from measuring the ships, we were able to put names to them based on those shipyard documents that we got for each ship. That we're lucky that they all happened to be a different length, so we could sort out which ship was what. And this is what we've been doing lately. This is more high tech. This is actually a 3D process called photogrammetry, where we go back and forth swimming across the wreck with our cameras, taking hundreds of photos, and then put those photos into the computer and turn it into a 3D model that we can spin around and zoom in on and see all the details. It's an incredible technique, and I'll show you the 3D images a little later in the talk. But that's just a printout of what the model looks like. So that is a 60-foot schooner, and we think it's the Eleanor Spurvey, which sank in the early 1950s in Conception Harbor. And you can see there's different, the bow of the wreck is up here. There's a windlass here, which is a winch for raising and lowering the anchor. That's the bottom part of the foremast. This schooner had 2 masts originally. And you can see there's a cargo hold here, and there's a cargo hatch here. And the back of the ship, the stern, is over here. And there's all kinds of artifacts probably buried in the mud here, but our group hasn't been doing any excavating, because that gets really expensive when you have to treat all the artifacts that you bring out of the water. So we've just been focusing on photography, non-disturbance surveys, and mapping. So now I want to get into some more exciting stuff that we've been doing in the last month. And that's been going out and photographing, locating and photographing recent shipwrecks. And the first 2 I'm going to talk about are the Pollux and Truckston. Most of you are probably familiar with the story of the Pollux and Truckston, 2 American warships that ran aground in 1942 down by St. Lawrence and Lawn on the Burin Peninsula. There were 389 US sailors aboard those 2 ships, and 203 of them died trying to get to shore alive. They either died in the water or they died of exposure after they reached shore. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the historic rescue by the residents of St. Lawrence and Lawn. If you ever get a chance to go down to St. Lawrence and Lawn and visit those sites, go out on the walk to Chambers Cove, I really encourage you to do it, because only then can you appreciate the superhuman efforts that the residents had to make to actually save those sailors. Getting them up the cliffs and then over miles of wild country in the middle of winter to the mine to warm them up. It's amazing that anybody survived. President Roosevelt was so impressed by the efforts of the local residents, he wrote a personal letter to the towns of St. Lawrence and Lawn thanking them. And as you guys probably have heard, the US government built a hospital in St. Lawrence to thank the folks and commemorate the events.
How high are those cliffs? Because I saw them this summer, and I don't know how anybody got over those cliffs.
I know, it's incredible. I'd say in most places they're between 150 and 200 feet high.
They're completely vertical.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could say again what she was just saying, because you can't hear it very well. I don't know if you, I guess you heard it though.
If you could just repeat the comment.
Oh, sure. Oh, okay. She was saying, she was asking how high the cliffs were down at Chambers Cove, and they're between 150 and 200 feet high. So that is one of the ships that went aground. That's the Truckston. That's the destroyer that Lanier Phillips was on. Most of you have probably heard of Mr. Phillips, who passed away recently. That was an old World War I destroyer that the Americans were using again in World War II. And I'll show you now what it looks like today. So it's in very shallow water in Chambers Cove, and the wave action from storms there has completely torn the ship apart. So there are only bits and pieces left on the bottom now. The hull and the decks have completely been taken apart, so there's only flat pieces of steel on the bottom. This is one of the propeller shafts, and you can see this was hundreds of feet long. You can see how big it was. So this took the power from the steam turbine engine back to turn the propellers. And that's one of the brackets there that would held it in the ship. That's the actual steam turbine that was the engine of the ship. There were two of these, and that's the connection to the propeller shaft. And this would have spun around much like a jet engine does today, and it was powered by steam. Because it was a destroyer and it had many guns on it, it had lots of ammunition. And that ammunition is now scattered over the sea bottom. So these are artillery shells for probably the 4-inch guns on the ship. And you can see they've mostly rotted away, except for the brass fuse at the top of the shell and the base of the shell. There's a fuse on its own. And there are also a lot of bullets for 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns all over the place here. And that's the brass casing for one of the shells. And this is the propeller shafts here, two of them in the background. So now we're going to turn to the Pollux. This was the larger ship that ran aground in '42. This was a US Navy supply ship. It wasn't civilian. So these were all US Navy sailors on board. Huge ship, carried about half again as many men on it as did the Truckston. And you can see it had 5 guns on it, 3 here at the back and 2 at the bow for defending itself. That's a very famous picture taken by a teenage girl at the time of the tragedy. She went out the day after, had a little box brownie camera that she got for Christmas, and basically she gave the finger to the US Navy officers out there and told them she was taking pictures for the Globe and Mail. And so she collected all these pictures, and it's amazing that we've got them today, because the US Navy did everything in their power to get the pictures from her and hide them. But that's the Pollux on Lawn Head. And we used these photographs to help us locate the wreck when we were out there a month ago. So this is me when we encountered the first bit of wreckage from the Pollux. And just to give you some context, the group we went out with, Ocean Quest Adventures, had had 2 expeditions out here previously, and they'd not found the wreckage of the Pollux. So we were very lucky on this trip to find it. And this is all wreckage in the background of the picture here. It looked like somebody had taken the contents of a hardware store and dumped it on the seafloor. So this ship, like the Truckston, was completely ripped apart, and there were only bits and pieces on the bottom. And you can see here there's padlocks. This one actually says USN, United States Navy, on it. And bolts and cutlery, and it literally just looked like a hardware store. And this is steel plating from the structure of the ship. It's been completely blasted apart by the wave action. These are a couple of porthole frames. So what was in the side of the ship to hold the portholes in place. This is one of the big steam boilers that was in the ship, and it's been ripped apart. So this is one part of that boiler. These are, I think they're 500-pound bombs that would be carried by a plane. So the Pollux was taking these as cargo to Argentia, and they were going to be used by the US Navy planes that were out hunting submarines. So they don't have the tail fins on them, but that's a huge bomb. They were this big. So we didn't monkey around with them at all. We just took a few pictures. This is one of the, this is the propeller shaft that was in the Pollux. It was even bigger than the ones in the Truckston. There's a diver there in the background for scale. And this was a huge gear from the Pollux. I believe that might have been part of the cargo winch machinery. And a diver is there for scale. So this is really big. It's probably 14 feet across or so. And that is one of the deck guns that was on the stern of the Pollux, with a diver there for scale. And again, this is 3D photogrammetry that I did of one of the deck guns on the Pollux. And I'll show that to you a little later on, the 3D imagery. And you can see there's a little scale bar there that's 40 centimeters long. Or, sorry, 50 centimeters long. Okay. I'm going to move on and show you a different shipwreck. This is the Argos. It was a Swedish cargo ship that ran aground on Cat Island, which is just south of Buren, on the Buren Peninsula, in 1925. If I remember correctly, it ran aground in the fog. 2 days after it ran aground, there was a whole crowd of fishermen from Buren salvaging what they could get from the wreck when it broke in two and sank, and it took 4 of the fishermen down with them. They might have been below deck in the thing when the thing broke apart and sank. It was a huge ship, 313 feet long, steel hull with a steam engine. And I don't think anybody's been diving on this one for more than 20 years, but we located it, and I was amazed at how big this was. So it's basically like, if you think of a 300-foot long steel ship that somebody has just flattened on the bottom. That's exactly what this was like. And I was swimming along taking photographs of it, and it kept going and going. It was so long. I was just amazed. So this shows you some of the deck and the beams in the deck, and a lot of the steel plate has corroded away. That's one of the boilers, and they're so heavily built they last for a very long time. So there was 2 of these great big boilers. They were probably 18 or 20 feet high off the bottom, and they would have been coal would have been used as fuel in those to make the steam to drive the engine to turn the propeller in the ship. And you can see this is all decks and hull that have been broken apart. That's an anchor there. It's the shaft of the anchor, and then 2 flukes like this, covered in marine growth. Everything's covered in coralline algae and urchins and everything else. That's one of the winches that was on the deck, either for raising and lowering the anchor or for putting cargo in and out of the holds of the ship. And there's a diver for scale. And the last wreck I'm going to show you pictures from is one we were just on a couple of weeks ago. And this is a schooner wreck called the Alberta Wareham, which is in the middle of Placentia Bay in a harbor on Long Island. So it's a Newfoundland schooner built in the 1950s. It is the biggest banking schooner, 2-masted schooner that was ever built in Newfoundland. It's like 135 feet long. It caught fire when it was at anchor and sank in Port Royal, in the harbor there at Port Royal in Placentia Bay in 1956. So it's not very old. And interesting, it had a cargo. It was basically taking all the contents, all the merchandise for general stores in the villages on the islands in Placentia Bay. And this one happened to be full of bags of flour. And when we were looking for this wreck, we talked to fishermen or retired fishermen in cabins along in the different villages on Long Island. And they all talked about eating smoky bread that was made from the flour from this wreck and all the flour tasted of smoke because of the fire that caused the ship to sink. So if you ever get a smoky tea bun, maybe you know where it came from. So this, when we dove down on this wreck, and none of us had ever been on it before, we found that it was completely covered in kelp. It was about 60 feet down, but it was like a garden when we got down there. You could hardly see the ship for all the seaweed that was growing on it. But we could see a few things. That's the bow. That's the bottom of the bow, where it turns into the keel, and some of the planking that made up the hull. And this picture here gives you, it might explain a bit why I don't have nice pictures of the whole boat. The water was quite murky, and as soon as you got 10 feet away from the boat, it disappeared in the murk. So unfortunately, all I've got is little shots of little parts of the boat like this. This is actually the mast, one of the masts of the boat, that broke off when it sank. And this is sticking out of the mud at the bottom. I don't know how it ended up there, but it's sticking straight up out of the mud. And it was actually, at the time it sank, it was sticking out of the top of the water, and fishermen cut it off because it was a hazard to other boats. They didn't want to run into it, put a hole in their boat. This is on top of the ship, looking down through holes in the deck into the cargo hold. Just a couple of pictures here. And this is one of our team actually swimming into the cargo hold. You can see it's pretty dark. It's black. He's got a bright light. And there's a picture of one of the bags of flour, what's left of it, in the cargo hold. So if I was more of a baker, I probably would have been interested in grabbing some. I should say that one of the conditions of the permit we get from the provincial government to do this work is we do not touch or take anything off these wrecks. All we take is photographs, and that's the deal. We're not in a position to be able to take care of the artifacts when we take them out of the water. That's really expensive. So we just have to look and take pictures and then share those pictures when we come back up. So now I'm going to shift gears a bit, and I'm going to talk about what we're doing to raise awareness of shipwreck history in the province. And a lot of that is sharing these photographs and the images that we get of these shipwrecks, because people in the communities where the shipwrecks happen, those shipwrecks were major events often in those communities, and they're really interested in seeing what the shipwrecks look like today. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is a project we did in partnership with the Bell Island Heritage Society, and we created a virtual museum exhibit, and that's just a fancy name for a website, on the history of the Bell Island shipwrecks. So it's called When World War II Came to Bell Island. And I'm not gonna go through the whole website because that would take forever. This was a big project. It took us 2 years of research and then putting in all the web content. But I'll just give you a little bit of a taste of what's there. So we had an idea, and we found that the Bell Island Heritage Society, who runs the Bell Island Museum, was interested in working with us on it. And it was basically to create this new website telling the story of the two U-boat attacks and the sinking of the 4 ore ships at Bell Island. And we wanted to highlight how the sinkings affected Bell Islanders and how important the shipwrecks are today. So that's the first page of the website, and I'm not going to bore you with going through different pages. But there's basically 20 chapters of the story. Why the Bell Island iron mines were important for the Allied war effort in the Second World War, a little bit about the Battle of the Atlantic and how the German submarines were sinking so many Allied cargo ships. And then it gets into the 2 attacks, the sinkings of the boats. And what we really wanted to do was tell the story of it from the perspective of Bell Islanders. So there's a chapter on how the Bell Islanders responded to the sinkings going out and rescuing the sailors. The fishermen went out in their boats and rescued the sailors who were drowning in the water. And then the role of the women in Lance Cove, who took all those sailors in, sometime, dozens into their homes, and dried them off, gave them dry clothes, fed them lots of hot tea, and took care of the ones that were wounded, because some of them were really grievously wounded by the explosions of the torpedoes. And that painting there is no exaggeration of the force of those torpedoes when they went off. So we've got lots of old photographs on the website. This is one of the ships that was sunk, being loaded with iron ore a little earlier in 1942. That's the captain of one of the U-boats, Rolf Rukeberg. That's one of the crew. He was 17 years old when that picture was taken in 1942. He was Gordon Hardy on the Rose Castle. The website includes professional documentary video that Jill Heinerth and Sea Proof TV have allowed us to use, which is a great tour of what it's like to dive on the shipwrecks. So all you non-divers can get a feeling for what it's like to explore the shipwrecks underwater. This is the home of Emma Reese, and she took in dozens of the sailors when they came out of the water and provided first aid and care to them so that they survived. And we get, her grandson gives us a video tour through the house and explains all the goings on in taking care of those sailors. And this is the former Lieutenant Governor, Fagan, at the 75th anniversary ceremony that was held over on Bell Island. And we've got a page on remembrance. So that's the memorial. It's over in Lance Cove. And on the back of this stone, this tells the story of the attacks and the sinkings. And on the back are the names of all the sailors. And as I mentioned before, there's 5 names on there of sailors who supposedly died, but actually didn't. And that's our gang. Every November 11th, we go down and place a wreath on one of the wrecks. And that was the 75th anniversary commemoration ceremony that I mentioned before. Okay, and that's the website address, and I don't expect you to memorize it, but if you go and search anything like, when World War II came to Bell Island on the internet, you'll find the website. And it's in both French and English. Okay, this is to remind me that this is where I'm just going to briefly show you the 3D stuff. I can do that. I got to spin it around.
Okay.
I'm just going to turn my back to you for a sec. So this is the 3D model of that schooner shipwreck that I mentioned before, and this is on the web. You can go and look at it.
Just so I don't do something.
Okay, sure. Okay. So this is on the web, and you can go and look at it, spin it around, go inside it, and we've actually put some labels on it so you can look at different features and it explains what they are. So the reason we're doing this is, again, to let non-divers get a feeling for what it's like to be down on those shipwrecks today. So that's what we call 3D photogrammetry. And we've done a few different objects underwater. This is the cannon on the Pollux. This was the deck gun. And you can see there's the operating end. So you can spin it around and look at it. And then we've done a couple of the cannons that are up at Balleen. And what's interesting is if you look at this cannon, it's got a great big gouge out of the side of it. So I think that may have been junk when it was on the ship. So they may have carried that cannon as ballast to help the ship be more stable rather than using it as a gun. Because it looks like it got hit by a cannonball in a fight, perhaps. Okay, just gonna go back here now. So that, if you go to our Facebook page, which I'll mention in a minute, all those 3D models are posted on the Facebook page. And they're also on a website called Sketchfab. If you search for the Shipwreck Society, you'll find them there.
Sketch what?
Sketchfab, F-A-B. So it's sketchfab.com. The other kinds of outreach we do are, in this case, we worked with the town of Conception Harbor. I showed you a map of the 3 whaling shipwrecks. That's the one that everybody sees above water. And the other 2 are just underwater back here. And we did a lot of historical research on those, and we've put it all on a storyboard that's now down by the shipwrecks there. And the town graciously made a big gravel parking lot, put in some picnic tables and a garbage can and all that. So it's now a bit of a tourist spot for them. If you want to see what we're doing currently, I'd suggest you check our Facebook site for the Shipwreck Preservation Society. We've got, well, we did have 400 members. It's probably up closer to 500 now. If you guys want to take a look at it, all you have to do is just request to join, and we'll sign you up, and you can look at all the pictures we've taken over the years. We also have a website that's had over 100,000 people visit it. And there's stuff there about what we're doing and information on different shipwrecks around the province and that sort of stuff. So I think that's about it. I don't want to keep